Everybody, thanks so much for joining into our call today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Joss and I'm the Learning Chair for EO Johannesburg. And this is our third learning event of the year. This month, as you all know, we celebrate Women's Day and Women's Month rather. And in today's talk, we're going to focus on an issue which not only impacts women, but our country as a whole. As you all know, our president recently acknowledged that second to COVID-19, gender-based violence is South Africa's biggest threat to date. So it gives me great pleasure and it's a great honor to have Professor Bonita Meyersfeld join us today to enlighten us on gender-based violence. We thought it was a good opportunity in Women's Month to learn more about gender-based violence. I think it's important that we really get to grips with what the issues are and not just make assumptions of what we think gender-based violence is. And yeah, I think Bonnie is the perfect person and for joining us today. So just I'm going to give a brief overview of Bonnie's profile. Bonnie is a human rights lawyer, academic and advocate of the High Court of South Africa. She's an associate professor at Wits Law School and a practicing advocate. From 2012 to 2017, she was the director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits. She's the editor of the South African Journal on Human Rights and the founding member of the chair of the board of Lawyers Against Abuse. Bonnie obtained her LLB cum laude from Wits and her master's and doctorate in law from Yale Law School. Bonnie teaches and publishes in the areas of international law, business and human rights, women's rights, and animal law. She is the author of the book Domestic Violence and International Law. Prior to Wits, Bonnie worked as a human rights law in the House of Lords and has worked at various non-government organizations in the States, the United Kingdom, and South Africa. Bonnie has consulted for and presented expert statements to various United Nations fora. Bonnie has been appointed Chevalier de l'Ordre National de Mérite, and which means Knight of the National Order of Merit, by the President of France in honor of her work in human rights and gender-based violence. Bonnie, thanks so much for joining us. Also, before we bring Bonnie in, would like to firstly thank Lara for all the work in setting up today's call as usual, and also a big thank you to Shona Young from our spousal forum who agreed, as we call it in EO, voluntold, to help me today in facilitating the session today, which I really appreciate. Thank you so much. And then also, as usual, Veronica Weinstein and Penguin Agency for all the work they do in the marketing materials and visuals that they do for all our events. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Shona, who's going to introduce and have a brief chat with Bonnie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Joss. Hi, everyone. As Joss mentioned, my name's Shona, and I'm part of the Spouses Forum. I think the only Spouses Forum, in fact, in Joburg. And thanks, Joss, for inviting me to be part of this discussion and facilitate the discussion today. And very big thank you, Bonnie, to coming to speak to us today at EO around such a valuable and important topic. So I think before we kick off, so Bonnie and I have had a brief chat around what today's talk is going to be about and what she's going to discuss with all of us. But because we're quite a small group, I think let's try and keep it as interactive as possible. So if you do have any questions while Bonnie's speaking, just please put them on the chat group, and we can then field the questions and keep the discussion going. So I think before we get into the real meat of the discussion, Bonnie, maybe you could start off by just sharing with us, your definition of what gender-based violence actually is, so we're all on the same page.
Sure, I'm really glad you asked that. And before I start, can I just say to everybody, it's amazing opportunity to chat to you. I really am grateful. I'm grateful that you're on this call, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm sorry I have to take it in the car. this is the craziness of COVID. I can't go into my home because I've been out, and I can't go into a restaurant because I'm nervous. But you have my full attention, and just please forgive my location. So the very notion of gender actually is something we should start off with, because a lot of people don't understand actually what gender is. And there's a difference between gender and sex. So sex are your reproductive organs, essentially. It's what you're born with in terms of the distinction between the male and the female. Obviously, and we should note this, sex is not divided into two categories, and we are aware of the fact that there are a miscellany of other categories of sexual binaries that just don't feature in our understanding of gender and sex. But I note it just for the sake of discussion. Gender is different from sex. Gender constitutes the characteristics that we ascribe to people based on their sex. And these essentially are stereotypes, right? We take biological facts and spin off them notions of characteristics, capabilities, and we start to believe in those characteristics and capabilities as being biologically linked, when they're not, because in fact they're stereotypes. And we hear these all the time, right? So we hear about women are compassionate, and that's what makes them good mothers. Men don't cry. Men are better at maths. They're logical. Women are irrational, especially at that time of the month. Men are stronger than women. Men are good at maths and science. Women have a flair for the cooking and the child rearing. It's where the essence of women is to be able to look after a child. And I challenge these stereotypes. I challenge these notions, because there are many women I know who are terrible mothers, and many men I know who are incredibly caring. There are powerful, physically strong women that take on very physically strong men and are able to be successful. In other words, what I'm saying is, much like during the time of Verwoerd, when he said, a black child only needs to learn how to lay a brick. That was the premise of Bantu education, based on this Aryan notion of race. It's interesting to me that we do the same thing with gender. How many times do we hear about girls going into university and really their life starts when they get married and have a child? How many women do you know whose careers have been put on hold because they're going to stay home and look after the children? And in those situations, how many of you know that that was a decision that could be made because the husband or the man in the partnership was equally going to make that option available? In other words, we have predetermined roles in society. And those roles are not always based on what we're really good at, what we're really capable of doing. The sinister side of this is that it does translate into discrimination. The predetermined way in which we should be treated in life leads to discrimination. So, for example, I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a conference room or a boardroom or even a court, and somebody will say to me, do you know when Professor Meyersfeld's going to get here? We're waiting for him. And in the meantime, won't you get me a cup of tea? Now, that example, on some level, there's a hilarity to it, right? And how you overcome that, of course, is to say, well, Professor Meyersfeld is here, and I would like a cup of tea. It would be great if you get me one. But the implication, right, immediately what happens in that moment is that you're designated into a certain role from which you have to uplift yourself. So you already have to show people, actually, I am the professional here. I'm not a woman here, with all the stereotypes that come around that. Which is not to say that I don't want to be understood as having wonderful characteristics, but I want them to be because of who I am. And that's the problem with gender-based discrimination. It's not about who you are. Why is this such a problem and a link to gender-based violence? Well, I'll tell you a story. This is an amalgamation of cases that I've been involved with for over 20 years. And they're real. these cases. 16 high school students, matric students, lodge a complaint with the police that their science teacher has been raping them in exchange for passing them in their science course. I take this case to a set of lawyers who I think can help. And the lawyers say to me, well, of course it's fake. There's no way that could happen. They're trying to bring him down because that's what women do. In fact, our legal system represents that. Up until about 15 years ago, we had a principle of law in our country that said you had to treat with caution any woman who made a rape claim. Because, and the jurisprudence is full of this, the judgments are full of this, because they say women are inclined to lie. Women are inclined to hysteria. And you have to be very careful when a woman comes forward and says she's raped, because it will ruin the reputation of the man. Doesn't this trope sound familiar? And the result is that violence against women is very seldom actually believed. It's only when we have a dead, mutilated body that we really believe that the person was hurt. For the most part, we have a situation in our country, but also globally, where 1 in 3 women will be raped, murdered, or assaulted, typically by an intimate partner, almost always by somebody she knows, during the course of her lifetime. In fact, gender-based violence by men against women, causes more death, disability, and ill health than tuberculosis, malaria, and cancer combined for women between the ages of 22 and 44. The statistics are staggering, but what that actually means is that 1 in 3 women, if you go out for dinner, well, when we used to go out for dinner, 1 in 3 women sitting around that table has been hurt. And that's a staggering concept. But the problem is, we have almost at the other end of the spectrum, a failure of accountability. So only 6% of rapes are actually ever reported in this country, 6%. Of those 6%, roughly 8% are taken to court because prosecutors deny prosecuting these cases because it's hard to prove. And of those 8%, very few result in a conviction. The result is that when women come to me, having been beaten or having been raped, having been hurt, I don't advise them as their first port of call to go to the police. As their first port of call, I advise them to go to social workers and psychologists, because that's where the real help will come. And what is the actual harm we're talking about? The harm is, and I've seen it all, raping, murdering, using a knife, using a gun, punching, breaking bones, aborting babies, enforced sterilization, enforced sex with other people, sex with minors, mutilation, hitting, and verbal abuse, denigrating a person, humiliating them, manipulating them into the belief that they are worth nothing and that therefore the violence perpetrated against them is in fact the norm. There's a spectrum of violence, and I'm telling you some of the more horrific violence. But take my word for it, this is the norm.
Sure, Bonnie, that's quite a picture that's been painted. I guess my question that comes to mind is, when we talk about gender-based violence, are we only referring to women and girls?
It's such a great question, Shona, because people always say to me, well, what about men? Men get hurt as well. Now, that's an absolutely correct truth. Men get hurt as well. In fact, if you look at the murder rate in this country, more men are killed than women. But the issue with gender-based violence is against the backdrop of gender-based discrimination, right? It is because one is a woman. It happens in the homes, it happens in our schools and our workplaces. So it's absolutely important to recognize that there is violence against men. But the issue is, and the reason why we have to look at the problem of violence against women and girls and people who don't comply with your dominant sexual orientation norm, you know, so it's a massive problem with lesbian women in this country, the so-called terrible label of corrective rape, right, where you're hurt because you can be hurt, because there's an element, this notion of hatred. And you know, I was sitting in a cafe in London once where next to us, in the table next to us was two men. They must have been in their early 20s, and two young boys. They must have been about 12, 13. And the men said to the boys, "What do you call a woman with a black eye?" I said, "What?" And they said, "A good start." "And what do you call a woman with two black eyes?" "A really good start." And they all started laughing, and much to the horror of my friends and husband, I got up and I went over to the table and I said, "Look, do you mind if I just sit down for a moment and talk to you? And what I want to say to you is, you've made a joke out of one of the greatest causes of death. You've made a joke out of the murder, the mass murder of women world round. And you've done it, the worst part is you've taught somebody else to do it. You've taught a young child about that." And so it's against the backdrop of people being told, don't throw like a girl. Don't run like a girl, right? Man up. All of these have quite insidious undertones. If you actually think about it and take a step back, what you're really saying is don't be like a girl. Why? Because there's something wrong with being like a girl. And that's the challenge with gender-based violence, is because as soon as you say, I'm better than you, it means that I have a right to do to you what I want. And that's the issue with gender-based violence and focusing on women and children.
Thanks. Bonnie, when you talk about the stats, you were mentioning stats around rape. I think you were mentioning, you know, one in three women in their, you know, 1 in 3 women get raped in this country. What do the stats in our country look like around gender-based violence compared to those in other countries? What does the data show us? And in your opinion, is that data correct?
Yeah. So South Africa, as we know, is known as the rape capital of the world. I'm not sure that's correct. I'm not sure. I think the key difference, there are a couple of key differences about South Africa. The first is that we are an unbelievably violent society. And so that includes all forms of violence. All of us who live in this country know that. And the violence really emanates from the violence wrought by apartheid. It was a structure of violence, and in many ways a structure that continues, right? Because we have a racialized economy. We have a sense of, you know, not for the majority of this country, things really haven't changed since apartheid. Now, that's not to justify or excuse violence, but it's to understand the context in it. We're a very unique society in that regard. Plus, we're an incredibly sexist society. And I really want to make this clear. Often in these discussions, there's a temptation to think about other people being sexist, other people committing harm. Usually it relates to people, you think to yourself, well, that's not my world. And that's in fact not correct. That's not correct. It's in all of our worlds, we are an incredibly patriarchal society. In January last year, there was not a single female CEO of one of the top 50 JSE listed companies. About 5% of board members of the top listed companies are women. And what this actually says is, what this translates into, is the fact that you have a violent society with an incredibly sexist community, which believes inherently that there's a role differentiation for women, that women shouldn't be pilots because they can't be trusted, right? That there's an essentially different perception of women. Add to that, that we've got a really broken justice system. a justice system that often perpetuates violence against women. All those things combined really make us quite unique in respect of worldwide statistics of rape. But I have to say, while we may be at the particular end of a spectrum of severity, we're not alone.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question before I open it up to the floor. And that's just, and it's a question as well I've been thinking about, is when we talk about violence and gender-based violence, does that only refer to physical violence?
Another great question, not at all. So I'll give you an example, and I think it's the best way of doing it, of the various ways in which violence can manifest. One story really stuck with me where a woman had just got married, and she and her husband, who were newlywed, went to see her family. And she teased him about something, and it upset him. After they left the house, on the pavement outside, he threw her to the ground, held her neck, and said, "Don't ever do that again." And what followed was 20 years of abuse, emotional abuse, where he said, "If I can do that to you in front of your family's home, know that I can do anything to you." There was a terrifying case of a woman who stayed trapped in a relationship that was physically and emotionally abusive, but she was trapped because she was told, "If you leave, I will kill your children." Interestingly, in that case, she actually had him murdered. And the emotional abuse is about breaking down a person, being told, "You're useless, everything you do is wrong, you have no benefit to society." That kind of emotional abuse in many instances can be more damning and more damaging than the physical abuse from which ultimately you recover. So yes, it's not just physical, emotional, psychological. There are incredible stories of women who have been led to be convinced that they are insane, unfit mothers, children taken away. And so the levels of emotional abuse, I think, are often very difficult to harness, right? It's an amorphous concept, but it is an extremely serious form of gender-based violence.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thank you.
Sure.
I'd like to open it up to all of you that are listening. Okay, I can see we've got a question already from Rob. Rob's asking, "We've heard about the problem. Where's the solution?"
Yeah. That's such a great question, Rob. So I was telling Shona and Joss that I actually wrote an article yesterday, and I wrote it about the fixation that we have with Women's Day, right? And it's something that's supposed to be about a celebration, and something that I've always loved about my husband's family is they celebrate everything. You know, they celebrate a good month in business, they celebrate birthdays, they celebrate the pet's birthday, you know, they celebrate everything. And they do that because my mother-in-law is very ill. Since she gave birth to my husband, she's deteriorated very, very badly. And so they celebrate everything because there's a moment, right, to celebrate. And the whole point about the celebration is that there's something positive. And what I've just told you is that there's nothing positive, right? What I've told you is that we are still in a situation of extraordinary violence and devastation. So what are we celebrating? Well, here's what I believe. Where you have such a large problem, you start on a very individualized basis. I recommend in general 3 notions of steps that people can and should take on an individual level, on a social, contextual, state level, as a country in our justice system. I can get into some of that as well. But what does it mean on an individual level? What role do we play? Well, the first is, if you have a child, think very carefully about how you're raising that child to believe in these gendered tropes and stereotypes that will set them on a course in life that may not be true to them. How many of us spend time with our male children, showing them how to throw a ball, showing them how to hit a ball, and no time with our daughters, showing them the same thing? So that when, in 10 years' time, they do go to school and throw a ball and everybody says to them, don't throw like a girl, well, yeah, she's throwing like a girl because she was never taught to throw. Why is that important? It's important because the more we expand our children's minds to know that they can be anything beyond these stereotypes, that they can be captains of industry, that they can be police officers and fire officers, that they can be teachers if they're boys, that they can be nurses if they're boys. The more we do that, the more we offset the discrimination. And the more we offset the discrimination, the more we create a society that will stop being patriarchal, and we remove one of those key foundational components. But there's another very, especially for men, a very important role that needs to be played. And that is debunking the myths and a cessation of the complicity that a lot of men bring to gender-based violence. Not all men hit and not all men hurt, but very few men will call out the sexist jokes. Very few men will see that it's a problem to speak about a wife as a ball and chain, because that language is the doorway to abuse. And how many of us really close the door on that and say to our friends when we're out for drinks on a Friday night, actually, no, it's really not okay to say that about a coworker, because she's in our office as a professional. She's not in our office as a person who's going to be sexualized, even if it's in terms of the banter around this table. And I'm not going to accept this notion that women are good only for a particular purpose that relates to domesticity, reproduction, or sex. And I'm going to call you out when you say those things, even the ones that aren't crass. Because again, that sets a standard. It's the same with race, right? If you think about race in this country, you know, of course everybody's still, you know, it's not, I'm not suggesting that nobody's racist, but racist rants are not acceptable socially. In fact, you can be criminally charged for them. And yet we go off and rant all the time about women. And we need to understand the harm that that language and ideology has. Lastly, call it when you see it. Call it when you see it. If you have a group of friends where the man says to the woman, go fuck yourself, that's a problem. That's a problem. It's the same if it's the other way around. But where you see a cowering, where you see manipulation, the chances are 1 in 3 that he's hurting her. And it may not be only physical. It may be emotional, but call it out. And how do you do that? Say to the woman, are you okay with that? Do you need anything? Or even better, stay in contact with her directly and say, you know, I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm here for you if you need anything. Because, yeah, you could be wrong and you could be making a bit of an idiot of yourself, but isn't that error better than allowing someone to feel isolated and cut off? Isn't it better that we try? It's a little bit like taking an AIDS test 20 years ago. We needed people who are high profile to take an AIDS test so that we stop stereotyping people who get AIDS, right? So that it becomes the norm, that you do the right thing. And it's amazing how people follow. That story I told you about England, at the end of my discussion with them, they were completely different. They were on board. So Rob, I hope that kind of answers your question. I can talk more about the kind of systemic changes that need to happen, but but those are some of the interpersonal and individual steps that really can be taken. And I should add also, sorry, I'm going on here, but as industry leaders, as entrepreneurs, it's in your hands to determine the culture of a workplace. Depending on the statistics you believe, between a third and a half of all women in the workplace will experience sexual harassment. You know, and that sexual harassment can be a lingering hug. It can be a request for sex in order to promote people. It can be the alienation. I mean, the alienation of an employee in a company when she refuses to engage in a romantic relationship with a senior. These are things that you can nip in the bud now. Sexual harassment procedures, making sure that yours is a culture of professional respect, that you don't have a sexualized workplace that is justified as, well, that's just good old banter. That's where your power lies. And in the creativity, because you wouldn't be entrepreneurs if you weren't creative.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks. I think linked to this and the solution and what we can do, there's a question around, if we want to raise an awareness around this topic, where can we direct people and what platforms can women go to get help, but confidentially?
Yeah. Sure, this is one of the hardest questions that I get, because there are very, very few lawyers that actually work in this area. And it's interesting. It's one of the most devastating aspects of our society, and yet there are no lawyers specialized, or very few lawyers specialized to help people in this situation. The organization I started, Lawyers Against Abuse, is a very localized entity. We actually now looking to expand it. Joss and Cedric have been champions of us since inception in 2011. And we have extremely skilled, extremely specialized lawyers working with extremely specialized social workers and psychologists to help women get through the system in whatever way they want and to get that assistance. But we service in a localized area. Ours is currently in Diepsloot, will be expanding probably in the next year. So my recommendation is to go to one of the South Africa's heroic organizations like Power, People Opposing Women Abuse, the Women's Legal Center. Sonke Gender Justice is another important entity. Whether or not individuals are going to find solace there is a different story. And part of the bigger systemic change that I've been talking about is the development of an incredibly specialized area of law that works together with psychology to ensure that women are aided in the legal system. You know, I often compare it to a commercial law firm. I'm sure all of you have been inside a commercial law firm at some stage or another. And when you go into the firm, I imagine that you'll be offered tea and coffee and biscuits, if not a meal. You will be, met with a commercial partner. Depending on the intricacy of the case, you might also meet with the tax partner, competition partner, the listings partner, whatever the particular aspect of the case is. And you'll have all of these services and all these specializations at your fingertips. And they don't say to you, here's the phone number of the competition tribunal, go there, here's the phone number of SARS. They represent you and facilitate that process. And that's the model we're establishing because it is in fact the more important legal issue that has to be addressed, and we wanted to match the commercial component. As matters stand, though, I don't have the answer that I know you're looking for.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Another question from Jed, very keen to hear about the reverse, the female perpetrated violence.
Like I say, it's a question that is often, there's a great deal of hype around it because it's exotic, right? There's an exotic sense of it. And there is female perpetrated violence, especially in same-sex relationships. But I understand what you're asking is, what about when women hurt men? It happens, absolutely happens. It is not of the level of violence against women. I say that noting, however, that it is vastly underreported. But again, I want to bring it back to status in society, because the reason why women are in abusive relationships, and one of the reasons why they stay in abusive relationships, is an economic one. There is currently a worldwide, but in South Africa as well, an 18% pay gap on average between women and men working in exactly the same field, doing exactly the same work with exactly the same qualifications. In other words, men are earning almost 20% more than women for the same work. And that's once you're in an industry. Industries are also sex dominated. So women dominated industries are nursing, teaching, domestic work, and these are traditionally very underpaid jobs. There's also terrible job insecurity. And as a result, women are economically dependent on men. So that's an example of a factor that changes the picture around women versus men as perpetrators. It's not to say that there is no violence perpetrated by women, but it's against the background of a system of discrimination that makes an extrication from a violent relationship incredibly difficult.
Thanks. Another question we've got here is around the correlation. Is there a correlation between poverty and gender-based violence?
Not in the extent to which it is conducted, but certainly you will find that high density areas, high levels of poverty also usually mean high levels of alcohol abuse for a host of reasons, including self-medication. And as a result, you will tend to have very high levels of gender-based violence occur in those circumstances. To be very, very blunt, if you live in a location of 6 houses with, you know, small homes with 20, 30 people across those homes, maybe even more, it's physically impossible to escape somebody who's going to hurt you. Whereas if you live in a big home, there are a fewer number of people who might hurt you. So on that level, yes, there is a correlation. And certainly there are no police stations, right? Very few police stations. Certainly in informal settlements, none. So where do you go for help, right? So it becomes even more normalized. Being poor, however, does not mean that as a woman, you are going to have a higher risk of gender-based violence because of your impoverished status, but because rather of the circumstances surrounding you factually. But I think it would be misguided not to remember that, like I said before, when you go out for dinner, a party of 10, there are at least 2 people sitting around that table who have been hurt.
Yeah, it's scary.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
And that's from my experience. And when I give these talks, there's always somebody who's triggered afterwards.
Yeah. I've got a question on the group here saying, you mentioned, which I think ties in, you mentioned the historical culture of violence in South Africa and how that is a contributing factor to the amount of gender-based violence and femicide. How do we undo this culture so the coming generations aren't raised, socialized the same way that we were?
I think a lot of it has to do with supporting the woman in our workplace. And by that, I include in our homes. If you think about the amount of money we pay domestic workers, I mean, I'm sure probably people on this call pay decent salaries, but this is some of the most insecure work. Domestic workers aren't included in the minimum wage legislation. Their contracts can be terminated with ease. They are incredibly dependent on a workplace that is going to be an easy one or a hard one by luck of the draw. And I think that by supporting women in those situations, paying them a decent salary, emancipating them, ensuring that they have the ability to look after themselves, look after their children, is one really big step towards undoing that culture. I think part of it is education, and I know we say that a lot, right? I know we say that a lot, but I think the contribution to education can come in many forms. So you've heard this talk, and if there's parts of this talk that resonates with you, why don't you go ask to speak at your kids' school about this? Or raise forums with your kids, and possibly with kids who are outside of your particular social circle in public schools. I think that those are some of the things that can be done on an interpersonal level. As a country as a whole, I think that the more people have to face a life of poverty and a struggle to survive, the more likely we are to have a violent society. Inequality and violence are inextricably linked. And that's a problem that obviously is much larger than any one of us. And one that, I mean, we could have another conversation about entirely. But that, I think, is going to be where the real break is. I must say I was so fortified by what the president said a few weeks ago, because actually, it's the first time any president of this country, including Nelson Mandela, has spoken in those terms about gender-based violence. First time. And I take a lot of comfort from that.
Yeah. Thanks. Another question that we've got here is there a correlation between sexual harassment in the workplace and gender-based violence? And do you think that corporates are doing enough to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace?
Yes and no. So, I mean, the workplace, if you think about it, women are, unless it's a female-dominated industry, which I've already explained, but even in those industries, women tend to be newcomers to those industries, right? Because we know about all the barriers to entry. When I was interviewing for articles, the questions I was asked were, well, aren't you going to get married and have a baby? Why should we train you? It's unthinkable today that that would be asked. So you can see that more and more women are coming into, well, I hope it's unthinkable. More and more women are coming into industries and into the world of work in that sense. And as a result, they're often in the minority, or they're in a heteronormative culture, in a culture in which there's a normalization of white and male, right? So as long as you act according to those norms, you can enter. But the reality is that women continue to be perceived in the same way as one does, as one perceives women in a domestic context, right? So many women talk about feeling like a guest at the table. They're not really part of the workplace. And it breeds a great deal of harassment. So you have a situation where a young woman enters the workplace. She is in a position to advance in her career and is faced with a level of hostility that actually will prevent her from continuing with that career. She will face it in society as well. What can you do, and what should corporates be doing? I actually do a lot of work with corporates, and the extent to which they are responsive to this problem differs. On the whole, we need a complete reimagination, complete reconceptualization of the way we deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. We need to understand that actually it's not safe for complainants to come forward. It's actually, nor should it be the responsibility only of complainants. I had a case recently where I've said to the management, you knew about this guy sexually harassing people over 5 years. You bring the case. You argue that this organization is not going to tolerate this guy because it offends you, not just the direct victim. But there is a shift. I'm starting to see a shift. So my categorical no is no, the majority of corporations, I think, have a long way to go. But there are a lot of corporations that are starting to take very serious steps to adjust their processes and responses.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Okay, I've got another question further up. Let me just have a look. How fearful are women in society generally? Is it occasional or continual?
I'm not sure I
Your
understand
opinion.
the question. Yeah, I mean, how fearful are women in society? It's probably quite an individualized answer, but what I can say is most women are probably a bit nervous to take an Uber on their own, especially at night. Most women are going to be very careful about the way they dress when going to particular areas because they're nervous. Most women are going to be aware of people walking behind them, wherever they are. Most women on campuses, for example, are not going to stay late in the library. Most women are going to be reluctant or nervous when staying late at work to walk to their car alone. And these are the types of uncertainties and insecurities that I think dominate a lot of women. You know, I think it's across men and women across the board who may fear violence as they drive into their homes, or if they're in a particularly raucous pub or shebeen, but women particularly will feel a specific type of fear correctly. And after this last spate of murders, you know, I'm nervous to go into a post office. And I think a lot of women are. And
Yeah.
should be.
Yeah. Thanks, Bonnie. Okay, we've got one more question, which I think might then take us to the end of the session. It's a question around where in the world have they got this right? And are there other characteristics that align or support this success? Okay,
where have they got this right?
Okay, thanks.
Where in the world have they got this right? Look, I think you're not going to find a perfect system. Sweden has quite an incredible response, but it hasn't necessarily worked. I did an analysis of 3 countries, Sweden, Nicaragua, and Mexico. All of them with very divergent approaches to gender-based violence, but all of them with very high levels of gender-based violence. I think the countries with the most successful response are those that have an intersectional and integrated response. That you have people who are mental health specialists, because make no mistake, the first thing a person needs when they've been hurt is not a lawyer. It's a psychologist or a social worker. It's someone or a really good friend. It's someone who can help them transition from trauma into a state of control. And we haven't even discussed the notions of trauma around this, but that really is what's needed. And that you have those professionals, those health professionals, work with lawyers and also with forensic specialists. And those are the systems that are the strongest. They're also ones that are, I think, quite honest and independent, and have specialized police involved. And those are the ones that are the most successful, but they're very few like that, because it costs money.
Thank you. And Bonnie, just one last one, because this also, I think, resonates with me and I'd like the answer to it. It's coming from a parent of 3 boys, and she says, is there any literature that you can suggest for teenage boys around gender?
Sure, I'll give it some thought and I'll shoot through some ideas. There's an amazing book called Backlash, The Undeclared War Against Women by Susan Faludi. And it's not directed at teenage boys specifically, but it talks about how the advertising industry, society, schools, stereotypes, all of that lead to the continual levels of violence against women. And you can see it in society, right? 3 years ago, #MeToo started, and there's been this unbelievable backlash against it, with men saying you're tarring and feathering, you're utilizing this to discredit me, and that naming and shaming is illegal. And I don't want to get into that debate, but the point is it demonstrates how we really can adjust our social interactions, which I think would be very useful literature. But I'll give it some more thought and send through some ideas.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Thanks, that would be great. And that brings the session to an end. So I'm going to hand it back over to Joss. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Shana and Bonnie. Thank you so much. I think for me, and hopefully for everyone, the biggest takeout for me was that this is an issue that I think, when we heard the president address us the other week on this, it felt almost like another issue that we were looking to the government to sort out for us. And what is the government going to do about this? And I think the biggest takeout for me was that actually every single one of us, not only at home, but in our workplaces, can actually do something very tangible. And it's not all just up to looking to the powers that be that is going to solve this problem. That was the biggest takeout for me. And I'm certain that everyone got a lot of benefit out of this. Whether we celebrate or commemorate or whatever we do, a happy Women's Month to everyone and all the women out there. Bonnie, thanks again. It's a true honor to have you share your insights with us. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.